The failing of the United Nations. What you need to know. Today, we spotlight the United Nations, an entity birthed from the ruins of the League of Nations, carrying a torch of hope for global peace and unity. This beacon, however, illuminates a myriad of challenges and criticisms besetting its mission in our contemporary world, prompting widespread calls for urgent reform. Initially conceived as a platform for fostering international cooperation and averting the scourge of war, the UN has struggled to adapt to the evolving complexities of global diplomacy and governance. The crux of the issue lies within its core structure, particularly the Security Council, where the power dynamics skewed in favor of 5 permanent members, often leading to a paralysis in decision-making during critical moments of need. This imbalance raises profound questions about the democratic ethos of the UN and its ability to represent the global community equitably. Instances like the veto by the United States of a widely supported resolution for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas underscore the systemic flaws that allow individual national interests to overshadow collective global will. Additionally, the UN Human Rights Council, with its controversial member selection, has faced scrutiny over its credibility and effectiveness in championing human rights globally. These dilemmas, compounded by high-profile resignations and a perceived inability to confront or resolve pressing global issues, underscore a crisis of confidence in the organization. As the UN stands at a crossroads, facing both geopolitical divisions and new global threats, the imperative for reform has never been more critical. The world watches, hopeful yet apprehensive, about the United Nations' capacity to reimagine itself to fulfill the lofty ideals upon which it was founded. The Security Council, a paradox of power. Central to the UN's framework is the Security Council, vested with the power to make decisions that can shape the course of international relations. It's here that the P5, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China hold veto power, a feature that sparked widespread debate about the Council's democratic legitimacy. This arrangement was designed for expedience, but often leads to gridlock as national interests come to the fore. Take, for instance, the Gaza crisis following the Hamas attack on October 7. Despite a global consensus on the need for a ceasefire, the U.S. used its veto power to block the resolution. This incident highlights how a single country's veto can override the collective will of the international community, potentially at the expense of humanitarian values. The Human Rights Council. Ideals vs. reality. Moving to the Human Rights Council, its mission is to protect and promote human rights worldwide. However, the inclusion of member states with questionable human rights records, such as China, raises concerns about the Council's ability to fulfill its mandate. Despite widespread reports of China's treatment of the Uyghurs, actions taken by the Council have been criticized as insufficient. In the corridors of the United Nations, the resignation of Craig Mockiber, a key figure in the UN's Human Rights Office, marks a significant moment of introspection. His departure is not just about an individual's disillusionment, but signifies a broader crisis of confidence within the organization. Mockiber's resignation points to the UN's struggle to address pressing global issues, such as the Gaza crisis, and highlights a pervasive sense of despair and frustration over its failure to uphold its peace and justice mandate. This moment of reckoning throws the UN's relevance into sharp relief. Despite its lofty goals, the UN grapples with the challenges posed by the very nations it aims to unify. The power dynamics within the organization often stall progress, with veto powers and political maneuvering undermining its ability to act decisively in times of crisis. The need for reform is undeniable. The UN must evolve to remain a relevant force for global peace and justice. The period of 2023-2024 has been marked by a series of global crises, challenging the efficacy and the very fabric of the United Nations as an institution designed to maintain international peace and security, promote global cooperation, and safeguard human rights. Despite its foundational aspirations, the UN has faced significant scrutiny regarding its response to these crises, underscoring systemic failures and highlighting the organization's struggle to adapt to the complexities of modern geopolitics. This examination delves into specific instances where the UN has been perceived as falling short in addressing pressing global issues. Number 1. The crisis in Ukraine. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine has starkly illustrated the limitations of the UN Security Council due to the paralysis caused by veto powers held by permanent members. Russia's position as a permanent member has significantly hindered the Council's ability to act decisively against the invasion, underscoring a profound structural flaw where one nation's interests can override the collective will for peace and security. This deadlock not only undermines the UN's credibility, but also highlights the need for urgent reform in its decision-making processes. Number 2. The escalation in Gaza. The United Nations faces a critical test of its effectiveness with the escalating conflict in Gaza during 2023-2024, highlighting severe humanitarian crises and the urgent need for international intervention. The UN's efforts to mediate peace and provide relief are hindered by political deadlock within the Security Council, where veto powers and geopolitical tensions prevent decisive action. This impasse exacerbates civilian suffering and diminishes faith in the UN as a mediator in global conflicts. Gaza's humanitarian plight, characterized by acute shortages of essential supplies, calls for immediate and comprehensive aid. Yet, political complications and the politicization of humanitarian efforts obstruct the delivery of necessary services, revealing a gap between the UN's humanitarian objectives and its practical achievements. Moreover, the UN's capacity to uphold human rights in extreme situations is questioned as reports of violations demand a robust response that the organization struggles to provide. Number 3. The climate emergency. Despite repeated warnings from scientists and environmentalists about the impending climate catastrophe, the UN's response has been criticized for its lack of concrete action and enforceable commitments. The COP28, expected to be a milestone in global climate action, has been marred by disputes among member states, with significant emitters failing to agree on ambitious targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This impasse reflects the organization's challenge in reconciling national interests with global survival, questioning its ability to lead in the fight against climate change. Number 4. Humanitarian crises in Ethiopia and Yemen. The humanitarian situations in Ethiopia and Yemen have deteriorated, with millions suffering from displacement, famine, and violence. The UN's efforts to mediate conflicts and deliver aid have been obstructed by logistical challenges, funding shortages, and political barriers, illustrating a gap between the organization's mandates and its on-ground efficacy. Critics argue that the UN's bureaucratic inertia and the politicization of humanitarian aid have compromised its response, leaving vulnerable populations in dire straits. Number 5. The Rohingya refugee crisis. The plight of the Rohingya refugees remains a blot on the international community's conscience. The UN's inability to effectively address the root causes of the crisis and hold the Myanmar government accountable for acts of genocide and displacement speaks to its limitations in protecting human rights and ensuring justice. The situation underscores a broader issue of the UN's human rights mechanisms being undercut by political considerations, diminishing its role as a guardian of global human rights. Number 6. Response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The global COVID-19 pandemic required a coordinated international response. Yet the UN's efforts, particularly in vaccine distribution and addressing the socioeconomic impacts, have faced criticism for being fragmented and insufficiently assertive. The failure to ensure equitable vaccine access across countries has exposed significant disparities, raising questions about the UN's role in facilitating global health equity and crisis management. The challenges faced by the United Nations in 2023-2024 highlight a critical juncture for the institution. The failures to adequately address these crises are symptomatic of deeper structural issues, including the need for Security Council reform, greater enforcement mechanisms for climate commitments, and a more agile, less politicized approach to humanitarian aid and human rights protection.